Hey guys, tonight we wake up somewhere strange. The ground under you feels like a fluffy moss carpet. The air smells faintly of overripe bananas, mixed with the kind of crisp morning dew that clings to your eyelashes. Birds you've never seen one, with what looks suspiciously like a tiny crown whistle, something that could either be a love song or a warning. And you sit up realizing you are in the Garden of Eden. It's gorgeous, yes, but it's also unsettlingly quiet, except for a distant burble of a brook and the occasional plop of something falling into water. You stand stretch, which feels great, and notice immediately you're wearing exactly nothing. Not even socks. That's right, you're naked in paradise, and even though no one's around yet, you feel a little weird about it. You take your first few tentative steps on soft earth, dodging a cricket the size of your hand, and realizing that somehow you're supposed to do something here, but what there are no instructions. Pinned to a tree, no helpful welcome packet, not even a map, and as you wander along a path framed with flowers in colors you can't even name, you can't help but wonder if you're already messing up by walking at all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, feel free to post your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where everyone's listening from now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pass a fig tree. The fruit glows faintly like a little lantern in the half-light. You reach out, not to pick it just yet, but just to feel it. Its skin is warm and velvety. Everything here seems alive in an attentive way, as though the vines themselves are watching you and quietly judging your posture. Somewhere in the bushes, a rustling sound suggests you're not actually alone. You swallow and keep moving. You come upon a small clearing in the center, a large flat stone surrounded by those same glowy figs. They're growing on a massive tree with roots so tangled and thick, you could swear it's swallowing the rock whole. You sit on the rock, which is surprisingly cool, and sigh. For the first time you notice just how quiet this place really is when you stop moving. A breeze passes through, smelling faintly like honey, and something else is that nutmeg cinnamon. Historians still argue whether this Eden actually smelled sweet, or if that's just a later romantic idea layered onto the story. You peer around, trying to figure out what to do next. The light here is strange, as though it's always just before sunset, golden, but soft, as if the sun can't quite decide if it wants to leave. Your stomach growls. You glance back at the fig tree, but hesitate. On the path ahead, you spot something odd. Footprints, not yours, not barefoot either. You can see the delicate impression of toes, but also something leafy. You follow them without thinking. As you round a bend, you nearly collide with someone, a woman crouched under another tree, examining some of that shiny fruit. She looks up at you, startled, then smirks, as if she expected you all along. Eve, you freeze. She stands, slowly brushing invisible dust from her knees, and you realize you're still very much unclothed. She doesn't seem to mind though. She tilts her head and says something you don't quite catch. It sounds like, well, are you going to help me, or just stand there like a stunned goat? You mumble something incoherent. You're still trying to figure out whether you're supposed to introduce yourself first, apologize for startling her, or maybe find some trousers instead. You point toward the fruit she's holding. Do you eat that? You ask finally. She holds it up, examining it critically. No idea, she says, but it's shiny and everything. Shiny's worth inspecting, right? You notice that despite her calm demeanor, she too keeps glancing at the fig tree, as though it holds some answer neither of you are quite ready to face. The two of you stand there awkwardly in the distance. You hear the faint hiss of something sliding through the grass. You're starting to get the impression this isn't quite the vacation brochure you were expecting. You and Eve both stand there for what feels like a full week, but is probably only 30 seconds, staring at each other with matching heedless expressions. She finally sighs and says, well, I suppose we ought to at least pretend to know what we're doing here. You nod vigorously, though you have no idea what she means. It turns out your first task, at least according to the mysterious voice that occasionally booms from nowhere, And everywhere is to name all the animals, every single one. As you walk together into yet another clearing, you find yourself face to face with a lineup of creatures waiting their turn, like it's some sort of celestial DMV. The first to step up is a long-necked beast, chewing languidly on tree leaves. You scratch your chin. A tall horse, you offer. Eve rolls her eyes. Giraffe, she corrects as though that word means anything yet. Next comes something squat and scaly with a snout and a tail like a whip. You squint. Flat lizard, you venture. Crocodile, says Eve, clearly enjoying herself. It goes on like this for what feels like forever. You name a tiny hopping fluffball. Pogo mouse, but Eve insists it's a kangaroo. You name a bird with an outrageous fan of feathers. Spiky chicken, which she admits is more creative than peacock, though historians still argue whether peacocks existed in the garden or showed up much later via trade routes. As the line dwindles, you find yourself struggling. At one point you call a rather disgruntled beetle Jeff. Eve snorts and lets you have that one. At least one thing becomes clear. This naming business is less about logic and more about not repeating yourself. Eventually you both collapse under a tree, laughing at the fact that you've just invented the words platypus and aardvark, and neither of you has any idea why the sun, or whatever passes for sun here, is still stuck at that eternal golden hour angle. A warm breeze sweeps through, rattling the fig leaves in the distance, and you feel a slight chill despite the light. It's only then you realize again you're still naked. You clear your throat. Eve glances at you and arches an eyebrow. You swear she almost smirks, but she just says, right, the rules. The voice had mentioned something about rules, something about not eating from that one particular tree. But as you try to recall the details, you realize you weren't exactly paying attention, because you'd been distracted by a squirrel doing what looked like an elaborate tap dance. Still, you vaguely remembered don't eat the shiny fruit, don't mess with the animals, don't. Was there something about swimming? Or was that encouraged? Eve rattles off the few she remembers while twirling a blade of grass around her finger. No. Touching the glowing tree. Don't bother the serpent, don't wander past the hills at dusk. And she pauses. Don't feed the crocodile dung sunscreen to the birds. Apparently it's for us only. That last one makes you choke. You hadn't even realized you were wearing what you now suspect is crocodile dung sunscreen. Eve gestures at the faint smear of beige on your shoulder. Good luck washing that off, she says. You're about to ask more about the serpent when you hear it, a long silky hiss behind. You freeze. Sure enough, curling its way down from a low branch is a snake, green and gold, and far larger than seems polite. It slithers to the ground, flicks its tongue, and gives you what can only be described as a salesman's grin. Lovely evening, isn't it? It says smoothly. You and Eve exchange glances. You try to respond, but your voice cracks halfway through a nervous yip. The serpent tilts its head and continues. Lovely garden, yes, but don't you ever wonder what's just beyond those hills? Eve glares. We're fine here, thanks. The snake chuckles softly and slinks off into the grass, but not before you catch it muttering something about potential clients. Once it's gone, you both exhale. That was something you say. Eve nods. Yeah. I don't trust him either. You get up to stretch and almost trip over a pile of flamingos. They seem offended that you didn't see them and stalk off haughtily, leaving a trail of pink feathers behind. You turn to say something to Eve but stop. She's staring past you, eyes wide. You follow her gaze and realize that somehow, while you were distracted by the flamingos, a whole herd of animals has shown up to watch you. They're silent, judgmental. Flamingo label judgmental. It dawns on you. They're looking at you because, well, you're still very much naked. You shift from one foot to the other, feeling all those eyes on you. Flamingos, giraffes, even the crocodile has re-emerged to judge silently from the shallows. You glance down at yourself, then at Eve. She's noticed too, though. She's better at pretending. It doesn't bother her. We should do something about this, you mumble. Eve smirks and raises a brow. You think. You scan the garden desperately for options. Ferns to wispy moss, to damp a curious bush of something that looks like giant lettuce. Tempting. You reach for it, and immediately pull back when it releases a cloud of purple dust that makes your eyes water for 10 solid minutes. You okay there? Eve asks, clearly amused. Fine, you wheeze. You settle on what seems like the only reasonable solution. Silk, the word pops into your head as though planted there by some divine Pinterest board. After all, silk sounds fancy, luxurious. You imagine yourself draped in shimmering folds of the stuff looking like royalty, even if the flamingos still glare at you, so naturally you and Eve set off to find the source. You comb through groves of trees until you stumble upon a few worms nibbling through some mulberry leaves. They're tiny, squishy, and deeply unimpressive. How hard could it be, you say optimistically. Reaching for one several hours later, you're sitting on a rock, sweaty, covered in bits of cocoon and nowhere closer to a usable thread of silk. Turns out, you can't just pluck silk off worms and have it magically weave itself into clothing. Who knew? Eve watches your failed attempts with poorly disguised glee. You're doing great, she deadpans, handing you yet another uncooperative worm. Historians still argue whether early humans really tried silk before fig leaves, or if that part of the story was added later to make us feel worse about our fashion choices. After some more futile tugging and one mildly aggressive worm, you sit back and sigh. Silk clearly isn't happening tonight. Meanwhile, Eve has been examining the figs again. She plucks a few leaves, holds them up to the light, and tilts her head thoughtfully. Not bad, she murmurs. You watch as she presses 2 large fig leaves against her chest and hips, securing them with a thin vine. Not exactly red carpet ready, but it does the job. You follow her lead though. It takes you 3 tries, and 1 incident involving a thorny vine before you get it right. The leaves are surprisingly soft, but not particularly cooperative. They keep folding in on themselves like shy turtles. Eve laughs quietly at your struggle. Don't worry, she says, nobody nails it on the first try. By the time you finish, the flamingos seem a little less judgmental. One even dips its head in what you swear is approval, but as you admire your handiwork, you can't help but feel disappointed. You thought you'd be draped in silk, glittering and magnificent, instead of well taped together by vines and fig sap. You look at Eve, who's adjusting her makeshift ensemble with ease. You think there's a better option, you ask. She shrugs. Maybe, but at least we're not completely naked anymore. You try to stand tall and confident, but the leaf at your hip keeps slipping. Eve reaches over to fix it, muttering something about rookie mistakes. You both burst into laughter, which feels good after the tension of the past few hours. Still, you can't help but wonder why fig leaves. Of all the plants in this vast garden, ferns, palms, even those giant lettuce things, why these scratchy, slightly sticky leaves? Maybe they were just handy. Eve suggests you look down at yourself, vines digging into your skin, fig sap sticking to your fingers, and sigh. Yeah, you say, handy. You're about to sit back down when you hear the faint hiss again. You freeze. The serpent is coiled lazily on a branch nearby, watching you with that same unsettling grin. Nice outfit, it says. You groan. The serpent's grin widens as you and Eve stand there in your slightly drooping fig leaves, feeling more self-conscious by the second. Its golden eyes gleam mischievously as it slowly lowers itself to the ground, curling into a loose coil near your feet. You too, it drawls, look positively rustic. Have you considered an upgrade? Evie crosses her arms. We tried silk, she says flatly. The serpent lets out a low chuckle, a sound that somehow makes the fig leaves feel even more inadequate. Ah yes, silk. Lovely idea. Tragically impractical, without thumbs a loom, and about 400 moths. You feel a little defensive, and mumble something about at least trying. Of course, the serpent says, smoothly flicking its tongue. But if you're open to suggestions, I know a little place just beyond those hills. Exclusive, private. All the finest materials, linen, cotton, even some early velvet, if you know who to ask. I could make introductions. You squint. You're selling real estate now. The serpent tilts its head, as if offended. I wouldn't call it selling, more curating opportunities. Eve snorts. Despite yourself, you're curious what's beyond the hills. You ask. The serpent's grin grows sharper. Ah, that's the question, isn't it? Some say it's just More rocks, others say it's where all the best fabrics are kept away from prying eyes. Historians still argue whether anyone actually ventured out there, or whether it's just a metaphor. You exchange a glance with Eve. She gives a subtle shake of her head. Thanks, you say. But we're good here. The serpent hums and shrugs. A surprisingly human gesture, then slithers back up into the branches, muttering something about short-sighted clients. You and Eve stand in silence for a moment, before bursting out laughing again. Well, Eve says, brushing a bit of leaf sap off her arm that was informative. You nod. Do you think he's right about what's out there? She squints toward the distant hills, where the light seems just a little darker. A little more foreboding, maybe, she says, but somehow, I doubt it comes with complimentary robes. You chuckle and sit down under the fig tree, trying to retie your leaves into something vaguely presentable. Eve sits beside you, plucking a blade of grass and weaving it idly between her fingers. Maybe we should at least see what other plants are out there, you suggest. Eve raises a brow. What you think? There's a secret stash of organic cashmere we missed, could be, you say, with mock seriousness. So, you get up again and wander deeper into the garden. You try everything, ferns too delicate, they tear if you so much as breathe on them, moss too clingy, a cluster of large flat leaves that smell faintly of mint, promising at first, until you realize they're covered in tiny invisible barbs that sting for hours. By the time you've tried and failed with 3 more plants, you're itchy, sticky, and increasingly appreciative of the humble fig leaf. At one point, you spot a bush with brilliant red leaves, and think you've struck gold, only to discover that the leaves crumble to dust at the slightest touch. Eve watches you wrestle with what turns out to be a patch of poison ivy, and mutters natural selection at its finest. You pause mid and glare at her. Don't worry, she says, I'm sure someone out there will find this charming. You sigh and plop down on a log. Fine fig leaves win. Evie nods sagely. They always do. You close your eyes, letting the warm breeze wash over you. Somewhere in the distance, a bird trills a tune that sounds suspiciously like a lullaby. You can almost forget the serpent's grin, almost. By now you and Eve have resigned yourselves to your leafy outfits, not exactly haute couture, but at least they're consistent. You adjust the vine at your waist for the 20th time, and sigh. So this is it then, our first wardrobe malfunction. You mutter. Eve chuckles softly. Better here than wherever those hills lead you. Grin faintly, and stand up to stretch. But as you do, your fig leaf catches on a low branch, and tears right down the middle. You freeze, holding the 2 halves in place. Well, you say dryly, there it is. Eve tilts her head, clearly trying not to laugh too loudly. Congratulations, you're making history, you quickly fashion. Another makeshift covering, though now the leaves feel even scratchier. You can't help but wonder. Again, why fig leaves? Surely somewhere in this sprawling garden, there had to be a more comfortable, less embarrassing option. You find yourself eyeing the silkworms again, but quickly dismiss the idea, after remembering the hours you wasted coaxing thread out of their stubborn little cocoons. It dawns on you, for perhaps the 100th time, that the garden, for all its beauty, isn't exactly designed for convenience. Still, the fig leaves work, more or less. You wander a little ways down the path, and stumble upon a curious patch of plants that shimmer faintly, almost like moonlight, caught in the leaves. Intrigued, you crouch and touch one, only for it to dissolve into dust the moment your fingers graze it. Eve, leaning against a tree behind you, shakes her head. Told you, she says. You sit back on your heels and sigh. Fine, you win fig leaves, it is. A warm breeze rustles through the trees as though to underscore the point. Still, you find yourself thinking about silk. Historians still argue whether early humans discovered silk before or after they left the mythical garden. Some say they only stumbled upon it much later, when they had tools and patience. Others claim the knowledge was always there, but too frustrating to bother with. You and Eve settle back under the fig tree, watching as the light begins to change subtly, but enough to notice. The golden glow softens into a muted amber, and the shadows stretch longer. Eve picks up a fallen fig and rolls it between her palms. Maybe. It's not about comfort, she muses. You glance at her. What do you mean, maybe? She says it's about being reminded that we're not supposed to feel too comfortable here. You consider that the leaves stick, they chafe, they make you hyper-aware of every movement, every stray branch, every prying bird's stare. Maybe she's right. You shift and lean back against the tree, feeling the rough bark press into your shoulders. You notice for the first time how the fig tree seems almost alive. Its branches curve slightly toward you, its roots tangled like purposeful knots. You close your eyes and listen to the distant burble of the brook, the gentle rustle of leaves, the faint hiss of something slithering through the undergrowth. Even here, in this quiet corner, you feel the weight of the garden's gaze. You open your eyes to see Eve watching you, her expression unreadable. You're thinking too hard, she says softly. You manage a wry smile always. You're about to respond when a sudden gust of wind scatters a shower of fig leaves around you. One lands squarely on your head, and Eve bursts into laughter so hard she nearly falls over. You pluck the leaf off your hair and try to look dignified, perfect fit. She teases you, groan, but you can't help laughing too. For a moment it feels almost okay, even with the itchy leaves, even with the serpent lurking just out of sight. The flamingos, now returned, and somehow even more smug than before, watch you both silently from a distance. You and Eve sit together in the fading light, adjusting your makeshift clothes, yet again, and wonder just for a fleeting moment what it would have felt like if silk had been an option. You wake the next morning, if you can call it morning here, where the light never really changes, with a faint ache in your back, and fig leaves plastered stubbornly to your skin. Eve is already up, stretching her arms toward the canopy with surprising grace, her own leaves rumpled, but holding. I think we should try again, she says matter-of-factly, as if no time at all has passed since you both collapsed last night in leafy defeat. You groan and sit up, peeling a particularly stubborn vine from your ankle. Try what silk? Something, she replies cryptically, already wandering toward the shimmering horizon. You scramble to follow her, your feet sinking slightly into the mossy ground with each step. You pass more trees, some draped in moss that seems to glow faintly, others heavy with flowers shaped like little bells that chime softly when the wind stirs them. You reach a small clearing where sunlight, or something like it, slants down through the branches. And there you find it, an enormous fig tree in full bloom, figs hanging so thick they weigh the branches down to the ground. It's breathtaking and also slightly intimidating. Eve steps up and runs her fingers over one of the figs. Did you know, she murmurs, that every fig has a tiny wasp inside it? You blink, which she smiles faintly. It's true, the tree and the wasp need each other. The wasp lays her eggs inside the fig, and in return she pollinates it. You stare at the fig in your hand, suddenly aware of the invisible drama inside. Historians still argue whether this fig-wasp relationship was known to ancient peoples, or if they just blissfully ate them without asking too many questions. Either way, you put the fig down a little more gingerly than before. Eve sits cross-legged at the base of the tree and begins plucking leaves, larger, smoother ones than you've been wearing. These, she says, holding one up to the light, might actually work. You join her, gathering a small pile. The leaves feel cool and slightly waxy, less prone to tearing together. You weave them into new outfits, slightly more refined than before. If you squint, you could almost call them tunics. But even as you tie the final vine belt, you catch yourself glancing at the distant mulberry bushes, thinking of silk. You decide to give it one more shot. Eve watches skeptically as you head toward the bushes, but she follows anyway. You find a cluster of silkworms nestled contentedly on their leaves, spinning their fine threads in slow, deliberate circles. You crouch beside them, marveling at the delicate strands, gleaming faintly in the warm light. You pluck one, and it snaps instantly. You've got to be kidding me, you mutter. Eve laughs softly. Maybe they're just not ready, she suggests, gently. You sigh and sit back on your heels, watching the worms go about their business. It occurs to you, not for the first time, that paradise seems to have its own timeline, and you are very much not in charge of it. You lie back in the grass and watch a cloud, shaped like a goat, drift lazily overhead. The flamingos reappear at the edge of the clearing, watching you with their usual blend of curiosity and disdain. You and Eve lie there in silence for a while, letting the faint hum of the garden wash over you. Even without silk, even covered in sticky fig sap and scratches, you feel oddly at peace for now at least. The garden is enough. You and Eve spend the next hour or what passes for an hour in this eternal golden-hued garden, trying to make the fig leaves look a little more like something someone would willingly wear. You braid vines into belts, you layer leaves for more coverage. You even experiment with a sort of leafy scarf. Eve insists hers is fashion-forward, though it looks suspiciously like a bundle of kale tied to her shoulder. Still, it's better than before, and you can't help but feel a tiny swell of pride as you examine your reflection in the smooth surface of a nearby pond. That pride doesn't last long from the reeds. At the edge of the water comes another hiss. You tense, already expecting more unsolicited fashion critique. Sure enough, the serpent emerges, its scales glinting in the dappled light. Well, it drawls, circling you both at least. You've stopped embarrassing yourselves quite so completely. You glare. Fig leaves, the serpent continues. So classic, so uninspired. I offered you an upgrade. You know, but you turned me down. We're fine, you say firmly. Of course, the serpent says smoothly. Fine. And yet it pauses dramatically. The hills are still there. You cross your arms. We're staying put. The serpent smirks. Suit yourselves. It's back into the grass, muttering something about missed opportunities and no vision. You roll your eyes and sit back down. Do you think he ever stops talking? You ask. Eve snorts, doubt it. You both watch as a dragonfly, its wings shimmering like tiny stained glass windows, darts across the pond. It lands briefly on your shoulder before zipping away again, leaving a faint tickle in its wake. You lie back in the grass, staring at the tangled canopy above. Somewhere in the distance, you hear what sounds like laughter, though whether it's the wind, the birds, or something else entirely, you can't tell. You close your eyes and feel the warmth of the garden seep into your skin. Historians still argue whether the garden was meant to be a permanent home or just a passing lesson, a place you're supposed to outgrow. You're interrupted by the faint rustle of leaves as Eve sits beside you, threading a long vine through her fingers. I think, she says thoughtfully, we should at least try to make these look intentional. You open one eye. How she gestures vaguely toward the fig tree. A little creativity goes a long way. So you spend the next stretch of time, could be minutes, could be hours, twisting vines into patterns, tucking smaller leaves into your belt, and even braiding a few flowers into the design. It's surprisingly satisfying. You catch Eve smiling as she adjusts a particularly well-placed leaf. Not bad, she admits. You grin. We're basically trendsetters, Eve chuckles. Just wait until the flamingos copy us. You glance at the birds, who, sure enough, seem to be watching you with renewed interest. You lie back again, letting the soft hum of the garden lull you into a strange kind of calm. The air smells faintly of figs and something darker, maybe the shadow of those distant hills. But for now you let it be. For now, fig leaves will do. By now you've accepted the fact that the serpent will always find you, whether you invite it or not. Sure enough, this time it's waiting for you on the path, coiled smugly atop a moss-covered rock. As you and Eve trudge past, my favorite clients, it hisses lightly. Still dressing yourselves in salad, I see you. Give it a look. We're fine, you say, with a little more conviction than you feel. The serpent grins wider, uncoiling just enough to flick its tongue lazily in your direction, of course. But tell me, have you even seen what's beyond those hills? How can you be so sure you're fine if you don't know what you're missing? You keep walking. Eve, however, stops. What exactly is out there? She asks finally. The serpent chuckles. Oh, many things. Markets, music, fabrics. You wouldn't believe you'd be the best dressed humans in history. You glance at Eve, who seems to be considering this a little too seriously, but then she shakes her head and starts walking again. We'll pass, she calls back. Suit yourselves, the serpent replies, though you can hear the faint amusement in its voice. You both continue down the path until the sound of its chuckle fades behind you. The garden seems quieter without it, and yet heavier. Somehow Eve eventually breaks the silence. Do you think, she asks, that we're supposed to stay here forever? You shrug. Historians still argue whether this was meant to be a permanent home, or just a starting point. She nods absently, and you both keep walking. At some point, you come across a strange patch of ground. The grass here grows in perfect spirals, like someone combed it into patterns. In the center of the spirals sits a small table of stone upon which rests a tiny woven mat. You stop and stare at it. Did you put that there? You ask. Eve shakes her head slowly. You pick it up, running your fingers over its surprisingly soft fibers. It's not fig leaf, not silk either. You squint at it, then turn it over, and there, faintly embroidered into the corner, is what you're pretty sure is a tiny flamingo. You glance at the birds standing at the edge of the clearing, and they immediately look away, pretending to be interested in the water. You think you begin. Evie snorts. I wouldn't put it past them. You set the mat back down, and keep moving. Further along you find another experiment in progress, a cluster of moss-covered stones, arranged like little stools, each draped with different plant materials. Some look suspiciously like attempts at cloaks. Eve picks one up and lets it fall back into place. Looks like we're not the first ones to try this, she says. You grin faintly. Nice too. No, even paradise needs a tailor. The light above you begins to shift, deepening into that almost sunset hue that never quite becomes night. The air smells faintly sweet now, and a soft breeze ruffles your leaves. You sit on one of the mossy stools and take a deep breath. This isn't so bad, you say. Eve sits beside you. No, she agrees. You look over at her, at the faint smear of sap on her cheek, at the stubborn glint in her eyes, and you can't help but smile. For all the serpent's talk, for all the temptation of silk and whatever lies beyond the hills, here in this strange, timeless place you feel okay. The flamingos watch you from a distance, heads tilted just slightly, as though conceding that maybe you've earned a little peace for now. You wake again to find the garden bathed in the same perpetual golden light, but the air feels different somehow, thicker maybe, or quieter. Eve is already standing at the edge of the clearing, staring off toward the hills. You join her, adjusting the vine at your waist, which yet again has come loose in the night. They seem closer today, she murmurs without turning. You follow her gaze and notice she's right. The distant hills loom a little larger, their outline sharper, as though daring you to finally venture beyond. But instead you both turn back to the familiar paths of the garden, wandering aimlessly under the watchful eyes of vines and flamingos alike. It doesn't take long before you stumble upon something strange, a series of shallow pits dug into the earth, each lined with smooth stones, and filled with, of all things, water lilies. At first glance, they seem decorative, but when you kneel closer you notice that the leaves of the lilies have been intricately stitched together into long thin sheets that float on the water's surface. Eve raises a brow. You think someone made those. You run your fingers over the seams, marveling at how neatly they're woven. Maybe, you say, or maybe the garden just does this. Historians still argue whether these early textile-like experiments were instinct, divine suggestion, or sheer boredom. Eve picks up one of the floating sheets and drapes it across her shoulders. It clings delicately, faintly perfumed with something floral, better than fig leaves, she observes. You agree. For the next little while, or whatever counts as a while here, you both sit by the water, stitching more lily sheets together. With thin vines the result is passable. It rustles faintly when you move, and makes you feel just slightly less like you're wearing a salad bar. You're almost proud of your handiwork when you hear the inevitable hiss. The serpent, of course. It winds its way onto a nearby rock, and watches you drape your new creation around yourself. Well, it drawls. That's certainly inventive, but hardly durable. One good rainstorm, and you'll be back to square one. You ignore it, but Eve smirks faintly. You know, she says to the serpent, you're welcome to offer actual help, instead of commentary. The serpent blinks as though surprised, then lets out what could almost be a laugh. My dear, it's as if I gave you all the answers, you'd never leave this place. With that, it vanishes back into the grass, leaving only the faintest impression of its coils on the rock. You and Eve exchange a look. Does it ever stop being cryptic? You ask. She shakes her head. You stand and adjust your lily leaf cloak, feeling a little bolder than before. As you walk back toward the fig tree, you catch sight of a bird. Not a flamingo this time, perched high on a branch, its feathers shimmer iridescent blue, and it seems to nod approvingly at your new outfit before flitting away. You wonder not for the first time if the entire garden is watching, silently tallying your mistakes and tiny triumphs, but you decide not to care. Not today. You and Eve fall into a quiet rhythm over the next stretch of time, weaving new sheets of lily and fig, adjusting vines, testing various combinations. At this point you're less worried about covering yourselves and more invested in winning the silent approval of the flamingos, who watch your progress like snooty judges at a fashion show. You're midway through tying a particularly stubborn vine into a waistband when you notice something odd, a faint hum, low and constant, coming from somewhere beyond the fig tree. Eve hears it too. She straightens her hands, stilling on the leaves. You exchange a look, and without a word, follow the sound. The garden grows denser. As you walk, the air heavier, the colors deeper. The path narrows into a corridor of intertwined branches, and for a moment, you feel as though you're walking through a tunnel of green light. Eventually you emerge into a clearing you've never seen before, and there at the center is what can only be described as a loom. It's huge, made of vines and stone, with threads of gold and silver stretched across it like rays of sunlight frozen in midair. You and Eve stare at it in silence. She steps closer and reaches out to touch the shimmering threads. They vibrate faintly, sending a soft chord through the clearing. You follow, running your fingers across a strand. It's warm, and for a second you swear you can hear voices, faint layered whispers, that vanish as soon as you pull your hand away. What is this, you ask? Quietly, Eve shakes her head. Historians still argue whether the loom was part of the original garden or left behind by someone. You both stand there taking it in. Eventually Eve gathers a few of the silvery threads and tries to weave them into her fig leaf outfit. It works, sort of. The thread gleams beautifully, but it frays quickly, almost melting back into nothing the moment she knots it. You try to, with the same result. The loom hums softly, as though amused by your clumsy attempts. You step back and watch as the golden threads ripple faintly in the light. Maybe some things aren't meant for you. Eve seems to come to the same conclusion, letting the silvery strand slip from her fingers. It was worth a try, she murmurs. You both return to your spot by the fig tree, your leafy garments rustling faintly with each step. The flamingos watch your approach unimpressed. As always, you sit back down and adjust your vines. For what feels like the 100th time, you say slowly, if we ever do figure this out, I fully expect those birds to applaud. Eve laughs softly, the sound mingling with the faint hum still lingering in your ears. From the loom you close your eyes and lean back against the tree, feeling its rough bark steady against your back. Whatever the loom is, or was, you figure it can wait. For now, fig leaves still win. You wake again though, really, you're not sure you even slept, and find the garden, as it always is, golden, fragrant, and faintly judging. Eve is already awake, crouched near the base of the fig tree, examining something in her hands. You shuffle over and see that it's a cocoon. Not just any cocoon though. This one glows faintly, and you can see the faint shimmer of silk peeking through tiny cracks in the outer shell. You think this is it, you ask, crouching beside her. She shrugs. Maybe. You both watch as the cocoon trembles, and with a soft tearing sound, a moth emerges, wings delicate and pearlescent, almost too fragile to believe. It sits for a moment, testing its wings before fluttering away and leaving behind a wisp of silk that dangles temptingly from the cracked cocoon. You reach for it, but it snaps the moment your fingers close around it. Figures, you mutter still. You gather the remnants of the cocoon, hoping they're sturdier. You and Eve spend the next long stretch of time coaxing silk from a series of cocoons, trying to twist the threads into something wearable. It goes about as well as you'd expect. The silk is exquisite, soft, cool, and gleaming faintly, but hopelessly delicate. Every time you knot a thread, it unravels. Every time you try to weave a panel, it collapses. Eve sits back, sighing. Maybe it's just not for us, she says finally. You glance at her and nod. Historians still argue whether silk was a happy accident discovered centuries later, or if someone like you tried and failed long before it ever caught on. You stand, stretching your fig leaves once again. Holding up better than your silk experiment. Eve rises to brushing a bit of sap off her hands. You both look down at your handiwork, a small pile of tangled threads, shimmering faintly in the light, and share a rueful smile. At least it looks pretty, you say. Eve chuckles. Like most impractical things, the flamingos, as if on cue, strut past and glance disdainfully at the failed silk. Before continuing on their way, you sit back down by the tree, watching the last of the moths flutter upward into the canopy. For now the garden seems to approve of your persistence. The air smells faintly of figs, and something sweeter, maybe a promise, maybe just the faint perfume of the moths. Either way, you lean back, close your eyes, and let yourself sink into the sound of leaves rustling and distant water flowing. For now, fig leaves will still have to do. You wake again to find yourself sprawled under the fig tree, the vines of your leafy outfit faintly damp with dew. Eve is sitting cross-legged nearby, absent-mindedly, braiding a vine into something that might be a belt or might just be a nervous habit. Morning, you mumble, stretching still. Morning, she replies, though the light hasn't changed, and probably never will. You sit up, adjusting the leaf at your shoulder, where it started to curl. Eve holds up her handiwork, a clumsy but determined attempt at stitching fig leaves together. With a long, tough vine, I think we're getting better, she says. You examine it and nod. Better is generous, but it's progress. You spend the next while hours, days together, sewing leaves into longer panels, braiding vines into something approaching thread, experimenting with knots and loops. At one point you even try to add a decorative flower at the collar. It immediately wilts and falls off. Still, it feels good to do something. The flamingos wander past, occasionally pausing just long enough to glance disapprovingly before continuing their endless circuit of the garden. One even lets out a low squawk that sounds suspiciously like laughter when your belt slips for the third time. You glare at it. Eve hides her smile. Maybe, she suggests gently, don't pick a fight with a flamingo. You'll lose, you sigh, and get back to work. You're halfway through weaving a particularly ambitious sleeve when you notice the serpent coiled in the branches above, watching silently. You're improving, it finally says, its voice almost admiring you. Pause, startled, but say nothing. It chuckles softly and continues. Of course, it says, there's an art to knowing when to stop. Some people, it adds, curling its tail lazily, spend their whole lives stitching leaves and never leave the garden. You glance up, frowning. Eve speaks for you. And some of us like it here, she says evenly. The serpent tilts its head, studying her for a long moment before slithering silently back into the shadows. You let out the breath you didn't know you were holding and return to your sewing. The sun, or whatever passes for it here, casts dappled light through the fig tree, warm and reassuring. You finish your leaf tunic and hold it up. It's not bad, crooked, lumpy, a little sticky, but not bad. You catch Eve smiling faintly at you and feel the smallest flicker of pride. Historians still argue whether the first garments stitched in Eden were acts of necessity or quiet defiance, a refusal to stay bare just because someone said you could. You decide it doesn't matter. You pull on your misshapen tunic and sit back under the fig tree, feeling its roots press solidly against your back above the flamingo's perch, improbably in the branches, looking faintly impressed. And for the first time in what feels like forever, you feel a little more like yourself. You wake to a sound you haven't heard before. It's not the hiss of the serpent, not the smug squawk of flamingos, not even the faint hum of the golden loom. It's footsteps. You and Eve both freeze, exchanging a quick look. The sound grows louder, soft but deliberate, crunching faintly over the moss, and then you see him, a figure tall and faintly glowing, steps into the clearing. His presence makes the air feel heavier, charged. Somehow, you realize too late that your hands are sticky with sap, and your fig leaf tunic is crooked. The figure stops a few feet away and regards you silently. You swallow hard. Eve straightens, smoothing her leaves with quiet dignity. I suppose, says the figure at last, his voice low and calm, you know why I'm here. You glance at Eve, who raises her chin but says nothing. You've covered yourselves, the figure observes, as if testing you. You nod. Yes, you say. The figure's gaze sweeps over the clearing, the torn leaves, the tangled vines, the pitiful silk scraps. Scattered around like broken dreams, not what we intended, he murmurs. You can't tell if he's disappointed or amused. You open your mouth to explain, but he holds up a hand. No need, he says gently. He turns, gesturing toward the distant hills. It's time, he says simply. Your stomach drops. Eve exhales slowly, her shoulders stiff. You glance down at your feet, noticing for the first time that the grass beneath you is starting to wither in faint patterns, as though the garden itself is nudging you. Out you adjust your vines one last time and step forward. Eve follows. The figure leads you down a narrow path that twists between trees and over streams you've never seen before. You pass under low arches of tangled branches, past flowers that close as you approach, past stones carved faintly with spirals you don't understand. The air grows cooler as you walk, the light dimmer, as though the garden is slowly turning its back on you. Finally you arrive at the gates. They're tall, wrought of something that looks like stone and gold at once, faintly glowing, faintly humming. The figure steps aside and gestures toward them. You can leave your leaves here, he says quietly. You and Eve glance at each other, but you don't. Instead you tighten the vines at your waist and step through the gates, still wrapped in your patchwork fig leaves, still clinging to the work of your own hands. The figure watches you go, silent. Historians still argue whether this was stubbornness or quiet triumph, whether covering yourself on the way out was an act of shame or pride. You don't bother to wonder. You and Eve walk through the gates, and they close softly behind you. For a moment, everything is quiet. Then you hear a faint snort behind you. You turn just in time to see a flamingo perched on top of the gate, watching you with something that looks just barely like respect. You smile faintly, adjust your leaves, and keep walking. The air outside the garden is different. You notice it immediately. Drier, rougher, carrying a faint scent of dust and rock. The ground beneath your feet feels gritty, uneven, sprinkled with tiny thorns that catch between your toes. You and Eve stop for a moment just past the gates and take it all in. Gone are the lush trees, the shimmering pond, the watchful flamingos. Before you lies a sprawling plain of rocks and low bushes with distant hills that no longer look quite so mysterious, just rocky and tired. You adjust your fig leaves, which already seem to be fraying at the edges, and glance at Eve. She gives you a wry smile. Well, she says, at least it's honest. You grin faintly though. Your stomach knots a little as you take your first few tentative steps into this new world. The ground crunches underfoot. The wind here bites at your skin, tugging at your vines and making the leaves flap like stubborn flags. You quickly realize that without the garden's constant warmth, your leafy clothes feel thin and awkward, doing little to shield you from the chill. Still, you keep walking. You pass clusters of thorn bushes that snag your vines, leaving faint scratches on your arms. You step over stones that shift and slide beneath you, threatening to trip you at every turn. Even the sun, or whatever light burns above you now, feels harsher, less forgiving. Eve walks quietly beside you, her gaze fixed ahead. Historians still argue whether this barren landscape was meant to humble you, or simply to test how well you could adapt. You're not sure it matters. You pause when you spot a herd of goats in the distance, watching you with flat, unreadable eyes. One of them bleats as if in judgment before turning and ambling away. You can't help but laugh softly. Eve glances at you, smirking. Even the goats are judging us now. You continue walking, your feet beginning to ache, the vines digging into your skin. You find a flat rock and sit for a moment, adjusting your leaves, which are now looking decidedly worse for wear. Eve sits beside you, pulling at a loose thread of vine and sighing. You both watch the horizon in silence. It's not beautiful, not the way the garden was, but there's something about it that feels possible. You close your eyes and let the rough wind ruffle what's left of your fig leaves. For now, that's enough. You and Eve walk on each step, crunching over dry earth. each breath drawing in that faint scent of stone and wild herbs. The garden's gates are long behind you now, barely visible in the shimmering air here. The world stretches endlessly, plains, scattered with stubborn shrubs, a few scraggly trees clinging to the edges of dry riverbeds, and above it all, a sky so vast it makes you feel small. You catch yourself thinking about the garden, the fig tree's shade, the faint hum of the loom, the flamingos' constant judging gaze. You almost miss them, but you keep walking. Your fig leaves have grown brittle at the edges, they're green, fading into a muted olive. But they still hold, barely stitched together with stubborn vines, and a little pride. You glance at Eve, who's walking just ahead. She notices your look and smirks faintly. What she asks, nothing you say. She shakes her head but keeps walking. Historians still argue whether the choice to keep wearing those leaves even out here was about modesty or just defiance. You figure it doesn't really matter. Up ahead, the ground rises into a gentle hill. You climb it slowly, your legs aching, now the vines digging deeper into your skin. When you reach the top, you stop below. You lies. An open plain dappled with soft grass, a trickling stream, and faintly the outline of what could be a small village in the distance. You let out a breath. You didn't realize you were holding. You and Eve stand there for a long time, just looking. The wind picks up, tugging at your leaves, whispering through the grass below you. Close your eyes, feeling the sun on your face. The faint weight of the garden still clinging to your shoulders. When you open them again, you find Eve watching you, her expression softer now. You ready? She asks. You glance down at your patchatogether outfit, at the brittle leaves and stubborn knots, and smile faintly. Yeah, you say let's go, and together you start down the hill, toward whatever comes next, the flamingos. If they're watching from afar, don't say a word this time, and for the first time since you woke in that strange garden, you don't feel like the leaves are a mistake. You feel like they're a beginning, and so you keep walking. The sky above softens to a dusky lavender, and the air grows still and gentle around you, the wind settling into a quiet hush. Your footsteps slow, each one easier than the last, as if the earth itself is laying out a softer path just for you. Ahead, the faint glimmer of stars begins to peek through the vast sky, each one a tiny watchful eye, blinking down as the world exhales into quiet. The horizon no longer looms but welcomes its sharp lines, blurring into soft silhouettes of hills and streams and distant lights. The fig leaves rustle faintly as you move, but you stop adjusting them now. Let them fall where they will. Let the vines loosen, and the sap dry, and the brittle edges curl as they like. It doesn't matter. Your breathing slows as you walk, steady, unhurried. And the last sounds of the garden, of the flamingos and the loom, and the serpent's whispered bargains fade into memory, leaving only the sound of your own quiet footsteps. And then you pause, you tilt your face to the cool air, and close your eyes, letting it all slip away, the weight of the garden, the endless hills, even the faint itch of the leaves, until all that's left is the soft murmur of the wind, the faint sigh of the earth beneath you, and the slow, easy rhythm of your breath. You're home now, wherever that may be. Good night.